All right, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Professor Washington. I'm sorry I cannot join you in person today, but I was excited to get to come and share a bit of some background on the history of women in Japan in the early modern periods to help you sort of have some context as you watch Mizoguchi's very famous films that do portray, I think, a lot of the modern problems and also ambitions of women in Japan. I'm going to share my video with you, my screen, so you can see the PowerPoint. And if you have questions, you can always email me, although I can't be here today in person. I hope that you will have a good time watching the films. So this lecture is titled for today, Tradition, Modernity, and Womanhood in Early 20th Century Japan. But to get through, I want to talk about the period that precedes that first. So if you go back in time to the Edo period, a period of unprecedented peace for 2.5 centuries in Japan, the place of women was quite regimented and dictated by a lot of Neo-Confucian ideology. And to give you a clear sense of what that looks like, I've provided this text. This is from a book by Kaibara Eken called The Career Learning for Women, and it's a guide for women, whether they're brides or they're already married and their wives, or if they're already, they already have children as mothers, to try and tell them how to behave. So please take a second and read through this text. And also please have a look at this as the next slide as the text continues. Excuse me. So as should be clear, I think, from this text, womanhood is defined in reference to man and manhood. It's beneath men in terms of status. Women owe men obedience, and they owe their husband's family obedience, and this kind of hierarchy is very important. And this is what Neo-Confucian ideology argues keeps society functioning well and makes for a better, more prosperous country. Another text, written a bit later by a woman, in fact, pulls together some of these same kinds of ideas, and it's much more concrete on the kinds of behavior that women are supposed to cultivate and to practice in shogunate era Japan in the 1600s, 1700s. Women are supposed to be first and foremost filial to their parents and respect their husbands, but they also have to be careful not to do certain things. And the list of things not to do is quite long. I think it's interesting to see that list. So I'm going to keep going. This list really points to what men saw as women's weaknesses and the fears that men had of women as well in this time period. And in this case, actually being channeled through a woman writer to give women advice on how to behave. And this is mostly aimed for the upper classes originally, who are the most literate, but these ideas filter down throughout society during this period of more connectivity and more sort of national cohesion as Japan becomes more prosperous and is at peace and able to sort of be more well-connected. And at the center of women's definition in the Edo period, 1600 to 1868, is the ie, or the household. And the woman is at the center of the household system. The system is a system in which the household is the most important entity, and how men, but also women, serve the household is sort of how we define their value. Here we can see this is a merchant household, so we can see the different levels of the house. The house would have a head of household, usually, and his wife, and then their children, but also the head of household's parents would also live there as well. And this was the main household. Sometimes there would be other households that were attached to as branch families, or branch households, I should say, to that main household. So again, this is an important part of defining womanhood in this time period. In terms of how women serve the household and men serve the household, there is a sort of a dichotomy. The dichotomy is that men correspond to the public and productive part of the household. They earn income, they produce goods, or they are part of the public and political realm, and women are part of the interior private realm, and they are performing what we call in sort of sociology roles that are reproductive. Those are roles that include not only childbearing, but also child rearing and caring for all of those in the household. It's important to note that even in this time period of these sort of strict categories, there was another category of womanhood. They were, I sort of missed some things here, but as we mentioned before, the patriarchal system, the multi-generational home, and the importance of the corporate entity of the household was paramount, and that it would also continue on in the future. So back to what I was saying, this other category of womanhood is those who are marginalized women who are on the who are not married and not in this the system, the household system. And men can go outside of marriage and they can engage in acts of both sexual but also just entertainment kind of activities with women who are in these other separate parallel roles. So the woman who works and lives in the home and is private is the woman of the earth, of the Giona, but there are women of play who men can go and seek. And while women cannot do that, they don't have the right to leave and sort of go out into the public world and to have these kinds of leisurely, playful interactions with men. Men do. And the women who men go to seek are prostitutes, courtesans, concubines. Prostitutes and courtesans, whereas wives and concubines belong more to the interior category. One of the most interesting things for foreigners who came to Japan in the 1800s was the prevalence of prostitution. Here we see prostitutes, but they're dressed as geisha, although they're prostitutes and they're not geisha. Geisha are a different kind of women who are not engaging typically in sexual intercourse, but who are entertaining men as courtesans. But prostitution was even more prevalent than the geisha services. This caught the eyes of foreigners because it was so prevalent, but it was an important part of society. And for Neo-Confucian ideology, this meant that the woman of play or the yujo could help keep balance in the household by providing this sort of outlet for entertainment and leisure for men. An important change that happens in the history of Japan as Japan goes from being semi-feudal, some would even say, to becoming a modernizing Western-style country occurs in 1853, and this has important consequences for women, and I want to begin that process, talk about that process next. So in 1853, after trying to come to Japan for 27 different attempts, different failed attempts, the United States again attempts to open trade with Japan. For the past 2 centuries and about 13 years, Japan has been closed to trade with all Western countries except for the Dutch, who come to a little island called Dejima in the Bay of Nagasaki, and they carry on trade there once a year. This was put in place because of concerns about Christianity's influence in Japan when Portuguese and later Spanish missionaries arrived, and worries about the ties of, back in the early 1600s, about ties between Portuguese and Spanish religious proselytes proselytizing and preaching and colonization by these other major European colonizing powers. So, make a long story short, Japan was a closed country to Western countries, at least for over 2 centuries. But by the 1820s and 30s, Russia and France and Great Britain and the US were all trying to get into, to open Japan for trade with the West, each time failing to do so. But in 1853, President Millard Fillmore of the United States writes a letter to the Emperor of Japan and sends Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan with 4 ships. These are steam-powered gunboats to deliver a message in this letter. And the letter essentially says, we want to trade with you. We want also for you to allow our whaling ships to come in and get fuel. Whaling is a big industry at this point, a major industry that in which the U.S. is trying to become a major player. And stopping Japan would allow them to actually make a larger trips and get more whales and be more successful. And the other part of this message is that I will come back in a year, and you have a year to think about it, but I'll bring more ships. And so this picture here is the return of Commodore Perry with a larger delegation from the United States, but also, as you can see, with 9 gunboats here in the harbor, just outside the capital of Edo. And you can also see the presence of soldiers driving home the point. So the arrival of, and the gunboat diplomacy, as we call it, of the United States forces the shogun, really isn't at this point in Japan, in charge of the country, to decide whether to open up Japan to trade with the West or not. And, you know, if not, to prepare for war, a war which they would definitely lose, a war which at this point would probably go the same way that the Opium War has gone in China, as they have tried to fight off Western imperialism. The entailing drama and conflict around this question is what helps in large part to overthrow the shogunate and bring in a new government. The Emperor Meiji on the left, or the last shogun on the right. These are the 2 choices, and in the end, the forces who are calling for a more modernized Japan, a less feudal Japan, a more westernized Japan, and they embrace the emperor, and they think the emperor should be the one to be in charge of Japan. That's sort of a side story. When they make this proclamation, they also proclaim that their new government is going to be a modern country and a very civilized country. And to accomplish that, they set out to, they make 5 promises or five oaths, and I have them here, you know, to have some sort of a diet or a parliament eventually, to unify all the classes, which gets rid of the separation that comes from Neo-Confucian class hierarchy, to liberate all classes as well, which means to remove the barriers between different kinds of classes, the merchant class, the peasant class, the samurai class, and the courtly class. But the most important 2 for today are the commitment to seek knowledge throughout the world, which they do in a great deal, seeking information on Western customs and Western society by going abroad, and also by bringing Western experts to Japan, but also the abolition of old evil customs, these things that they think have held Japan back and must be redone or remade in order to, or you know, gotten rid of to allow Japan to move forward as a modern country. So in terms of womanhood in Japan, these last 2, the knowledge seeking, both in Japan and outside of Japan, and the removal of sort of ancient traditions that were usually confined to women and just pivoting to women, these were important elements that were focused on in the oaths, and that would come to play a big part in the future of Japan. Right away, we see these changes taking shape for women. The creation of a compulsory system of national education in 1872, you know, includes not just men, but also, as you can see here, girls are also going to be required to go to school for, at this point, 4 years, later on for 6 years. And by 1905, this has had a huge impact. We're talking about 93% or so of girls are attending and finishing at this point, 1905, 6 years of primary school, making Japan probably the most literate country in the world at this point, and the best educated country in the world. So as you can imagine, this is a big deal for women. But beyond that, we also see that opening of Japan to the West has brought American and British missionaries who are intent upon trying to improve the situation of women, which, you know, still has many of the remnants, right, of this previous Neo-Confucian system very much present, despite all these changes that are happening. So missionaries create schools for girls, 22 schools in the first decade of the schools being opened, which provide women education beyond compulsory primary school, sort of going all the way up to what today we might call high school, and giving them more opportunity that way as well. And then by 1899, the government has sort of caught on to the potential of women. One of the assumptions is that women are going to represent for Japan their level of civilization, and how far they have progressed on sort of this continuum or this spectrum of civilization that Westerners have set up. And missionaries are there to look at that as well. And so over this time, we're talking about a few thousand students, usually elite girl students, who go through the system and who become, you know, representative of Japan's brightest women. They marry men who are very important, but they also sometimes on their own seek careers in teaching as educators, which is an important element there. And things happen with my sound. And at this point in time, teaching and later on journalism becomes some of the few careers that are open to women, but they can achieve these through higher education. In 1899, the government actually then mandates that each prefecture in Japan, sort of like each state, needs to have a women's higher school, and they immediately create these schools. In some contrast to missionary schools, these schools are trying to prepare women to become good wives and wise mothers, to help them to be better, to better serve the household and also the state. The curriculum is geared towards things like sewing and you know, and cooking and cleaning, but it also includes things like language education in Japanese and also English, history, math, science, etc. So in many ways, it is more than they could have had, you know, access to before. But even in these different elements, from the English language, you know, content and Japanese content, the ideology of Neo-Confucianism has sort of crept back in and become part of the curriculum as well. And that sort of strong love for Japan is also cultivated in these kinds of contexts. As women are more educated and more able to claim the right to be in the public sphere, the government of Japan, this new Meiji government, has a difficult time with that. And they are not willing to let women be equal participants in this new state or in this new society at all. Again, based in sort of misogynistic male chauvinism that is prevalent in Japan, and that sort of dates back to the Edo period, you know, the past 2.5 centuries, but also that reflects or sort of mirrors a lot of Western sentiment about women as well. And so when the government opens the first imperial diet, the parliament of Japan, women are not allowed to attend, to even go and watch the diet proceedings. The year before that, and sort of in anticipation of this opening of the diet, women are also barred from taking part in political associations or assemblies of any type. And these two rules are sort of the basis for future laws, 1900 and again in 1925 that prohibit women from taking part in political activities. So women are still being, despite all this change, right, for women, are still being pushed towards the private sphere of the home and allowed just very little access through careers in education and journalism to be public at all. This is the Civil Code, which also underlines these categories. I want you to take a look briefly here. And what I point out is that, in terms of what people qualify someone to be part of society, they can be a woman, if they are a woman, to receive or employ capital, or to give a loan or take a loan, to file a lawsuit, to be involved in issues of succession, unless her husband gives her that right. And we also see in Section 4, I'll point out that women, if they, and as you can see, are not at all subject to the same kinds of laws. So we still see it's modern and it's westernized, but it still has much in common with the previous system. Despite this fact, though, and what I want to sort of pivot to for the last part of my lecture is that women are thinking very strongly about how they can access public sphere, how they can be heard, and some of them, and they're also being educated, and they're pursuing education with missionaries and also in public institutions, and they're going to sort of increasingly call for more of a voice. Kishida Toshiko, who we see here, was a feminist, and the movement that actually in Japan creates sort of forces the government to make good on its promise to create a parliament or a diet. The Freedom of People's Rights Movement makes speeches throughout the country and names thousands of people in Japan, and in her speeches that called for more democracy and more government transparency and more governance. She also called for women's equality and rights, and she criticized Neo-Confucian treatment of women in the public sphere. Another feminist who also a little bit younger, but also takes place in the same movement, is an activist and feminist named Fukuda Hideko, and she also makes speeches, but she's more of a journalist, and so she becomes, as an author and as a journalistic author and as the author of books as well, she becomes well known in circles for promoting women's more public presence and increasing their rights. She also creates her own magazine or journal called Women of the World, which has the goal of bringing this women's rights to the fore. The women who are educated by missionaries and those who are oftentimes Christians are also perhaps the most important segment of society pushing for more women's rights. They have taken missionary school at face value and the education they received there, the promises of a better future. They've also watched oftentimes single missionary educators who are women as teachers, and they've sort of sometimes taken them on as role models. And so they have become very convinced that women in Japan deserve more rights and more progressive treatment by the government and by men in the household. And one of the ways in which they sort of parlay this context into is create is going to be put the WCTU is calling for. So temperance or not drinking alcohol, and to concubinage, having concubines, second and third wives in Japan, into licensed legal prostitution, and these kinds of things. They also published their own monthly news paper, newsletter, monthly news magazine, really, for several years as well. But what's actually happened for a much larger set of rights that women are trying to have the right to practice on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to choose who they marry, as well as the right to divorce, and the right to also be in a household as in life. It looks like it's about Christianity and morality, but it's actually about women's rights in many ways. Another figure I want to highlight is Hiratsuka Raicho, who does go to missionary schools, and it then sort of breaks away from that sector of education. But she becomes a leading feminist author. She starts her own journal called Blue Stocking in 1911, and this is a journal that is a liberal it's a feminist journal, right? Highlighting women's intellectual abilities and the drive for equal rights for women. This, I'll let you have a look at that very briefly here. Is the beginning of the first article for the issue that she is editing. In this case, she's written this. Most important words to take away here, I think, are the combination of the neologism of new woman in Japan, right? The new woman is a woman in Japan who is modern and has agency, and usually who has education, and is not going to be bound by the constraints of society intends to put on her. This poem from Yasano Akiko, a very famous poet who wrote and published her essay, her poems in the journal Blue Stocking, I think also begins to sort of play with the idea of women's agency as well, and women's ownership of their bodies. And perhaps the most famous author talk about today is actually a fiction author named Yoshi Eko. She was magazines bought her serialized book chapters, and she was, the equivalent of today is sort of a $multi-million earning author. And she was also putting forth in her novels the image of a new woman who was, again, not bound by the constraints that society was placing upon her, and that also was willing to sometimes go it alone. She herself was not married, and she had a life that may have involved an affair with a woman, but in any case, she definitely bequeathed her wealth to a woman, and she had to find a way to do that. So it was complicated, but she found a way to do that. So she represents sort of the pinnacle of new womanhood in the 1930s and 40s as an author and as a woman, and sort of where the kind of liberating ideas that were circulating at this time. She earned more than the prime minister. She lived with a woman. She really put women's issues in the forefront, not just of women's journals, as Hiratsuka Raicho and others had done before them, but also of the average housewife and the average novel reading man as well, and sort of, I think, was a pioneer in that way as well. So what I'll finish with is the fact that the 1920s sort of saw this new category, the new woman in Japan, the Shin Fujin, come into its own. they were well educated. They had gone through compulsory education, but they also received usually higher education as well at the high school level, and oftentimes even beyond that. And then they used that knowledge and training to become nurses, teachers, to work in clerical positions, and as I mentioned before, become journalists. But some even also became physicians. And so this was a kind of womanhood that dressed in the latest Western clothes that were freer than the traditional Japanese clothes, and openly did that. Women who drank at cafes and smoked cigarettes together, and who talked about politics even together sometimes. And so it was definitely a new phase for womanhood in Japan. And what I'll finish with the creation of the new women. Sorry, I can't see this. The New Women's Association, which was founded by the aforementioned Hiratsuka Raicho and a younger protege of hers, Ichikawa Fusae, who we see here at the very bottom of your screen. They essentially turned meetings and conversations about women's rights into the first sort of association for women's liberation and women's rights and suffrage in Japan. They wanted women to be liberated from their husbands and independent. They wanted women to be able to vote, and they wanted to repeal Article 5, which is the one that prohibited women from taking part in political parties or associations. And they actually they were successful in having this article repealed. So Japan came a long way thanks to these kinds of women, even as the society that was entirely male dominated and voted in by men continued to suppress women and try to maintain this previous, in some ways, continuity with the past. But also some sort of keep applying some of the Western kinds of sexism and chauvinism that were prevalent. So in what you're going to watch today, you will see that women are, in fact, in a difficult situation in Japan during the 1930s and 1940s, as they have to grapple with these new possibilities, right? These new kinds of womanhood and ideals that are available, but also with the bonds of family and the bonds with men that they might have as lovers or husbands, and how these are in conversation, but also in conflict. So that's a very quick background. I hope that you have learned a little bit from this. And again, I look forward, if you have questions, to hearing from you. Enjoy your films.